My name is Peter Kaldor, as Russ just said. Let me introduce my panellists to you for this discussion of, is there scope for Sharia law in Australia? So on my left is Mermet Ozalp. He is an Islamic theologian, academic and community activist, and he is the founder and executive director of Islamic Sciences and Research Academy. And on Mermet's left is Sam Green. Sam comes from Tasmania, though we won't hold that against him, of course. And Sam works with the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students and has a particular interest in Islamic Christian dialogue. And we will be joined in due course by Diaa Mohamed. Diaa is the founder of MyPeace. You may recall last year various posters that were put up around Sydney. So Diaa was the man behind that. Okay, well, let's get underway. You may or may not know that last year, in May 2011, the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils made a submission to a parliamentary inquiry on policy, calling for Muslims to be offered religious pluralism. In response, the then Commonwealth Attorney General of the time, Robert McClelland, said that there was no place for Sharia law in Australian society, and the government rejected any proposal for its introduction. He said, as our citizenship pledge makes clear, coming to Australia means obeying Australian laws and upholding Australian values. Australia's brand of multiculturalism promotes integration. If there's an inconsistency between cultural values and the rule of law, then Australian law wins out. So with those sorts of thoughts in the background, I might turn to ask Mermet, please share with us, how do you see what Sharia is, and do you have freedom in this country to practice it?
Well, Sharia is the practical and social reflection of Islam in a nutshell. It means literally a way to a watering hole, and it includes ethics, worship, liturgy, and law as well. Sharia has been a legal system, or it has become and developed into a legal system across Muslim history, and it was one of the most sophisticated legal system in the world for much of the Middle Ages, for about 1,000 years. And I feel that in the last 150 years, due to colonization, European colonization of the Muslim world, the dynamic nature of Sharia is lost. So you got a legal system which stopped developing for about 150, 200 years. And a lot of the problems that we have in our time due to either talking about Sharia, application of Sharia, originates from this discontinuity. So you have to look always to the past when you are applying Sharia. Another point is that Sharia is usually reduced to some penal codes, and then that's the focus, and it detracts us from the wide range of Islamic law itself, which is, as I said, very complex and sophisticated. And if we by Muslims, some Muslims like Taliban, they reduce it to these penal codes, and also other Muslims pick up on, non-Muslims pick up on this and see something seriously wrong with Islam or Sharia. And,
yeah.
Yeah.
So Sam, do you also see it as a total way of life from your understanding?
Absolutely. When I've spoken to Muslims, they've made it clear that the Sharia is not just about the penal system, but it's about how you pray, how you do almost every aspect of your life. And so I guess in that regard, when I'm thinking of this question of the scope of Sharia in Australia, now I may be jumping ahead here, but Muslims are free to practice a lot of it already.
So is that how you would see it, Mermet? You're free to practice, essentially?
I think so. I think that a lot of what we would call Sharia aspects are already ingrained in Australia. One example is in Sharia, there's something called HISPA. HISPA is public regulation, and when we have things like work cover, who goes and checks construction sites, we have councils checking businesses, putting regulations, putting fines. So these were all, it's part of Sharia, and it's called the institution of HISPA, and it was very much there in the Muslim history applied. And you have examples like, for example, in 1522 in Ottoman Empire, there was regulations about how much you can load a donkey. The owner can load a donkey without the animal being overloaded and therefore suffering. So to end animal suffering, they put regulations, and that was all part of Sharia, the HISPA institutions. Today we do that by limiting how much trucks can carry and things like that.
So you're saying there was red tape even 500 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say red tape. I would say regulations for the benefit of everybody, the whole society. There's an Islamic Muslim jurist called, his name is Shatibi, he died in 1388. He wrote a book called The Objectives of Sharia. It's very important, and I feel that anyone who hasn't read Shatibi should not speak about Sharia. It's a bit, you need to really understand what he's talking about. And he says that the objective of Sharia, the ultimate objective is to promote good and benefit for human beings and to prevent evil and harm and therefore the suffering that human beings come. And this includes crimes as well as a local businessman who is doing things which is not at the interest of the public. So Islamic law and regulations would step in and actually stop that by putting fines and other punishments or whatever.
I think we'll come a bit later. There'll be questions on this, no doubt, and we'll come back to this question of what good does it bring, as you've highlighted. Just perhaps for a moment, are there differences of opinion, and this is some of the questions coming through, within the Muslim community as to what is Sharia, and how important is the life of Muhammad?
Look, I think there's a confusion, firstly. Within Sharia itself, there is differences of opinion within its methodology, but in our time, we have lots of confusion. The first confusion comes with what is Sharia, and there's another term, fiqh. A lot of people don't know that. Sharia is strictly defined as the social, practical, and legal principles that comes in the Quran, which there's about 100 verses out of 6,238. And from the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, and strictly speaking, there's about 1,000 from 30,000 of his sayings, social and legal implications. So that's Sharia, but the human understanding of Sharia is called fiqh. And literally in Arabic, fiqh means understanding. So Muslims were humble to think that, look, we can humanly, it's possible to understand, but we could make mistakes, or we could have difference of opinion in the way we understand and interpret these verse sources. And that's where some of the confusion and difference of opinion comes.
So you've mentioned the importance, if you're going to talk about this topic, to really understand it. Sam, where do you derive your understanding of Sharia from?
Sure. The way that I derive my understanding is that I listen to Muslims, I read the Quran, the Hadiths, and also from books like these, which are summary books of Sharia. So this is from the Sufi school of the Sunni.
It's Hanafi school, actually. Yeah.
I thought it was Sufi. Anyway, it's one of the four ones. We can check that out later on. There we go, that one there, Sufi. Anyway, and this is an example, and I guess I'd bring this up here because for many of us, we may not even know how to approach this subject. We might be thinking, I know something of the Bible, but where do I even begin with the Hadith? Where do I even begin with Sharia? And I guess there are books out here which would be a place to begin.
So you'd recommend people enlighten themselves?
Well, certainly you can look at this. This is one of the standard books, and it brings together what the Quran and the Hadith say, and would give those decisions of a particular Islamic school on those subjects.
Okay.
Well, just to comment on that,
quickly, yep.
This book is a summary of, there's Imam Suyuti who wrote in 11th century, he's got 30 volumes of Islamic Sharia. And also, a lot of these books don't have the evidence that is behind some of these rulings. They'll just tell you the ruling. They won't go into the methodology and the textual evidence and what interpretation was used. So, and most of them are translated, and sometimes there are translation mistakes. I'll tell you one example. Like Bernard Lewis writes about authority in Muslim societies, and it judges it on a particular verse where it says, obey God, the Prophet, and those leaders who are leaders over you. He translates it like that. But the real translation is leaders from amongst you. Can you imagine the difference that it makes? One is more democratic, the other one's more authoritarian. And his conclusion is based on a wrong translation. I mean, that's one of the problems that we have in our time.
Good. Well, I might touch on something you've raised earlier and pass to Diaa to comment. You mentioned that ultimately Sharia is about, perhaps remind me of your exact words, Mermet, about bringing good to society, something to that effect. That was the ultimate object of Sharia.
Promoting good and beneficial,
Yep.
and preventing evil and harm and prevent suffering in society.
Well, thank you.
And
so there's a number
if
of...
I may add that...
I might need to just to move on. There are a number of questions coming through. It's come a couple of times and yesterday as well. In light of that, and I'll turn to Diaa to have a go at answering it, how do we make sense then of understanding that the reaction that we've seen to this video that's been withdrawn from Google about the Prophet Muhammad and seeing the violent reactions? How do we make sense of that in light of Mohammed's comments?
I think that to make sense of it, I think that one must understand the relevance or significance of the Prophet Muhammad to Muslims and who he is, and to what degree do we love the Prophet Muhammad. In Islam, we are taught that he's the final prophet to come after Jesus. He's the seal of the prophets, he gave us the Quran, and he's the greatest man to basically ever live. And as Muslims, we love the Prophet Muhammad more than we love, for example, our mothers and fathers, or at least we're taught to do so. So when someone goes out and puts such an offensive video on there, the reaction of the Muslims is one of, and I'm not saying the reaction that happened a few weeks ago, that's obviously wrong, and we don't condone that, but that's where it stems from, is that love and the passion that we have for the Prophet Muhammad. But one should understand who he is first and what significance, what role he played in the world and in society. And you don't have to take the Muslims' point of view from it. You look at what Westerners and non-Muslims have written about him, and you get sayings like "Savior of humanity." You get the greatest man to ever live. These are actually non-Muslims saying these things. Quoting Michael H. Hart, for example, who called him the greatest man to ever live. Quoting George Bernard Shaw, who said that the more that I've researched him shows that he is indeed the saviour of humanity. The more I read about him, I'm more convinced that indeed he's the saviour of humanity. So when a video is made, in such offence, in such filth about a man who we, like I said, love more than we love our family, you can understand the reaction.
I'd like to just, if you don't mind, push a little bit more
sure.
on this, because it's not an isolated event. If we think back to Salman Rushdie, if we think to the Danish cartoons, if we think now to what's happened, how, according to Sharia, ought Muslims engage with their opponents?
Please.
Yeah. According to Sharia, how ought they engage with their opponents?
I think firstly we need to understand there's a lot of politics going into these things on both sides when something like this come out. I think the whole world now knows that if you want to provoke Muslims, you know what to do. Produce a cartoon, and if you want to put Muslims on the street, this is what you do. On the other hand, when Muslims protest, they're not just protesting about these things. Like for instance, in the Dutch cartoon scenario, in Pakistan, they went into, they burned effigies of the United States president in front of the US consulate. What's the US got to do with the cartoons? It was in Holland. So these other issues come in, which are not related to that incident. So,
but if I come back to the question, according to Sharia, how should Muslims engage their opponents?
Well, there's plenty of examples from the time of the Prophet. He was vilified many times, many years. He was tortured, persecuted. We never see him going and attacking people or protesting. There are no protests in the lifetime of the Prophet. And on the contrary, when Muslims were attacked in the Battle of Uhud, someone asked him to condemn or damn the people by praying to God. He says, I came as a mercy. I did not come for damnation of people. He says, oh God, forgive my people, they don't know. This is the example we get from Prophet Muhammad, and I think this is the approach that Muslims should follow as their prophet.
Okay. Yeah. I'd like to turn to you, Sam, and perhaps in your comments, could you also enlighten us as to how the Christian engages with opponents in your understanding?
Well, with both of these, I think it's helpful to look at the example of Muhammad and the example of Jesus. And certainly I would agree with what Mohamed has said about Muhammad's response, but I would say that's how he responded when he was in Mecca. That's certainly not how he responded when he was in Medina, although the Battle of Uhud is during that time.
This is Medina time I'm talking.
Yeah. But there are numerous examples which I see not just in the early Sirat literature, but also used in Islamic publications of people who insult Muhammad, and Muhammad had them assassinated. So that there are quite a number of assassinations that he does to those who insult him. Now, that is in his life in that Medinan period, and so I'd say that is part of the picture as well.
Well, I disagree. Prophet Muhammad never asked for assassination of anybody. Just the biggest evidence of Prophet's magnanimity is when he captures Mecca, he declares a general amnesty to people who persecuted him and his followers for 20 years, killed his family members, tortured his daughter, some people. He declares forgiveness at a time in 7th century when usually rulers went and just sacked the whole city and killed everybody. I think this is the greatest evidence for the nature of Prophet Muhammad. There was one incident, I think that's what you're referring to, where someone is seeding sedition amongst trying to create war between Mecca and Medina. There's already warfare and between other tribes and developing a coalition, and this person was killed by some of the followers. Prophet did not ask him directly.
But I need to say that there are examples of Muhammad having old men, women assassinated, and even when he conquered Mecca, there were still 10 people that he had assassinated. And he may not have sacked the city, but that was because he had reasons that they capitulated, converted to Islam, and it was not beneficial. But
I'm sorry about 10 people. We are giving misinformation here. 10 people were listed as war criminals. Like, these people are known to torture and kill others. And eventually, one of them died and 9 of them were forgiven as well. They came and lived with Muslims. So we just got to be correct on our...
Okay, we might need to agree to disagree at this point. But Sam, can you answer the second part of the question? How do you see the Christian way here possibly...
Oh, absolutely. You see, the gospel message is about Jesus, is about about how he humbled himself amongst us, and he also accepted humiliation. And so when Jesus is abused, he actually turns the other cheek. This is where the phrase turn the other cheek comes from the example of Jesus. And so Christians will want to follow the example of Jesus, who does two things. He speaks the truth boldly and confronts people about their sin, but he also is prepared to turn the other cheek and not to impose himself in that sort of in that other way.
Do you want to add something?
It's not entirely true. I don't know the impression you get from Christians or the people turn the other cheek and love their neighbour and all that sort of stuff. But Jesus also had a militant side to himself too. I mean, he was being persecuted by the Jews after all. He did, for example, instruct his disciples to pick up swords, and in discussions with himself and other people, it's metaphorical, but he meant it literal. Pick up your swords. There's another verse in the Bible where Jesus says, "For those who don't follow me, chop their heads off." So, and I'm not disagreeing with Jesus. I take Jesus as a prophet of God. But what I'm saying is you're showing one side of the truth, sort of like on the adverse side of the Prophet Muhammad, where he, was in wars and was violent and, Islam spread by the sword, and you have Jesus here who turned the other cheek. And I'm saying they're exactly the same. Even if you read the life of Jesus and the life of Prophet Muhammad, almost the same. There was mercy on one side, and there was let's get ready for war, and pick up your swords, and and I can quote you these from the Bible. And Muhammad had a merciful forgive, and a time of war. I mean, you understand these people are men of God, and they're coming with a message, and every message that's come from God, whether it be Moses, Jesus, Abe, they're all opposed, and they're all persecuted for it. And so war was inevitable in all their lives. So to paint Jesus as purely that I think is telling half the story, because he also did have a militant side where he ordered his disciples to pick up swords because he knew he was about to go to war with the Jews. And when the Jews came in greater numbers, obviously Jesus is not a silly man, he's a smart man, smartest man at the time. He told his disciples, put down your swords, for who lives by the sword dies with the sword. But he knew that. But because the Jews brought the Romans with him, the tables had changed. So to say that one man of God is completely peaceful is not entirely true. He couldn't have been, because he was about to get persecuted.
Yeah. I think there, though, that you really haven't done justice to what the gospel says about Jesus, because there are numerous occasions where he is saying that he hasn't come to build a kingdom of this earth.
That's right.
And so we actually do believe that Jesus will come with the sword, but that's when he comes bringing the judgment of God.
Yep, we believe that also.
But that's not this time in which we live now. And so the parable you referred to is referring to Jesus coming back, and we would agree with that, but it was never how Jesus behaved with his disciples. He never picked up the sword and went and fought anybody.
I'm quoting Jesus, I'm not quoting
authors. I know the reference you mean in Acts 2, but he actually, when they say, here they are, he says, that's enough.
I might need to ask you to agree to disagree as well at this point and move on. We've got a couple of questions, and this came up in yesterday's forum as well. Diaa, I might turn to you at this point. Do we have a country in the world where we could point to and say, there is a place where Sharia is perfectly implemented?
Not at this time, no. I mean, there's countries who implement forms of Sharia and in the penal system and the like, but in its totality, unfortunately, not right now.
So would that suggest that Sharia is almost an idealistic system? It's not really possible to implement?
No, it's very possible, but as Mel was saying, there's a lot of political agendas. If one, for example, if one is ruling the country, which is a lot of the times in, the Sharia epitomises what democracy really is, and it's not by having Labor, Liberal, or Democrats, Republicans. It's the leader is chosen by a council. It's called a shura, so a council of men who decide who is the best to lead them. And there's no way, so that's a bit of democracy.
But does that exist anyway?
It doesn't, because people have their own agendas and they can't let the will of the people dictate, because then they might lose power.
So is it in an ideal scenario for any practicing Muslim that they would wish for a full implementation of Sharia?
Oh, definitely. I mean, look, we as Muslims say, Sharia law is God-given law. And given that we are the creations of God, who better to give us the rules of the game than the creator of humans? Now, it's a system in its totality where it has the solutions to everything. Solutions to alcoholism, gambling, surplus of women, violence, the way you treat women. And the common misconception is that Islam oppresses the women, when in fact it's Islam who liberates the women. We are the liberator of women, and what the West, and I'm generalizing he does, is, in my view, oppress the woman. And it's a common misconception that people have. But it is the perfect system, is Islamic law, obviously, because we believe it's God-given law.
There have been a few questions about the treatment of women as well, so I might just dwell on that for a moment, just briefly. Particularly, there was one question that, why should a woman need to prove to a cleric under Sharia law, and I think this is one of the areas that there's suggestions to change our system here in the area of family law, why should a woman need to prove to a cleric that she can't be reconciled with her husband when an Australian court has already issued a divorce?
Can I take that?
Please, yeah.
We can't apply part of Sharia and then another part is some other legal system. Then you'll have miscarriage of justice.
So let's
whichever way you look at it. So we have a situation here where we're talking about Australian divorce and marriage laws, and then bringing in one aspect of Islamic law. Of course, it's going to look bad. And so that's I think what Diaa Mohamed was saying. I feel that either you implement Sharia ground up properly, building the society, and then the laws need to be adapted to modern circumstances where it's possible and where it can be reinterpreted.
So is this an area that you'd like to see change in Australia in terms of our laws
of
family law?
I don't think we need laws to be changed in Australia, but just there needs to be recognition that there are problems and issues with Muslim community where especially Muslim women, they need to feel that the divorce has been approved by a religious authority, and that authority does not exist, a legal religious authority in Australia. That's why we're having issues and problems.
But presumably if she sought a divorce and granted one by an Australian government, she's not the one needing the clearance from a cleric if she sought the divorce. So why should she need to get that from a cleric as well?
In this country she doesn't. That doesn't mean to say what Australia's offering is wrong or invalid. It's just, two systems. For example, depending on where you go to get a driver's license, the requirements are different. It doesn't mean one requirement is different to the other. It just means for that it's different. Now, if she's a Muslim, she needs to obey by what the Muslim rules are, and that's to follow the procedure, whatever it may be.
Look, there are opinions in the Muslim world that if any court approves the divorce, it's acceptable in Islam as well. But most Muslims don't know these things, so they need to go and consult someone. And depending on who they consult, they might get different answers. So we have this, again, confusion. It comes to the confusion that I've been talking about.
I'd like to take the discussion a step further and beyond family law, and let's consider if we move towards sort of a full acceptance of Sharia, albeit that isn't the case anywhere at the moment in the world. There has been comments made by the European Court of Human Rights back in 2001 that Sharia is not compatible with democracy. And this comment came as a result of the Turkish Constitutional Court's decision to ban the Islamist party Refah on the grounds that, quote, democracy is the antithesis of Sharia. So, assuming that Sharia is this totalising system, how can we reconcile that with a system that we have here in Australia, which is founded on the separation of church and state?
I think the greatest refutation of that statement is the Arab Springs that we have witnessed last year and we're still witnessing. Muslim world wants democracy, as its majority of people want that. And Turkey has moved on since then. In 2002, Tayyip Erdogan, who comes from the Refah party line, he has changed his approach. He understood that mixing religion with politics in a rhetoric way was not the right way to go. And since then, he won 3 elections in Turkey, and Turkey has become one of the rising stars in the Middle East. So this just goes to show that we need to find ways of incorporating our Islamic principles in modern life. And if you do that, then you find solutions, But if you go head on saying Islam is not compatible with democracy or democracy is not compatible with Islam, you get nowhere.
Is there, Sam, in your understanding here, though, a fundamental point of difference with Christianity in the understanding of church and state?
Certainly, Christianity doesn't have an optimism about human governments. The message of the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel is that when humans try to run a theocracy, that they fail. And it's a reflection of our own sinfulness. And when we fail as governments, we fail spectacularly. And so, from the Christian perspective, the reason why we don't see Sharia being implemented properly is not because of the leaders are corrupt, but because everyone's corrupt. And so it will never work properly. And so this is why Christians have this understanding of the separation of church and state, because we realise that it's not our hope to be establishing a Christian government in that sense, because we're waiting for God to bring that government.
So how ought a Christian person relate to a secular government?
Well, the way that the Christians relate is, and I guess this is a reflection of how Islam has a different type of guidance to how Christianity does. With a lot of the Sharia, it is, as has been said, there is rules for pretty well everything. Rules about how you go to the toilet, rules about how you, rules on almost everything you could possibly think of. Christianity is not like that. Christianity has several types of guidance from the scriptures. One is laws, which we are just to keep the laws. There's another large section from the books of Solomon of wisdom. And wisdom is sometimes you do this, sometimes you've got to do that. There's a large wisdom section. And then there's a section of what's called liberty or freedom. And so we see that our engagement with the government is an interaction of those things rather than just of laws being given, which we then want to impose as a government would on the population.
Can I just say quickly, though, that the idea that Islamic law or Sharia law and democracy can't go hand in hand is actually false. Sharia law is a democracy. It's what you interpret to be a democracy. We are the ones that establish democracy. The way a leader comes about is by general council, and he can be removed if he is doing injustice. A good example of that, for example, is when the second Khalifa, his name was Umar, took over, and he stood in front of his people and he said, if I ever lead you astray, I want you to step on my face into the ground. And then someone stood up and he said, we will chop your head off if you lead us astray. He didn't call ASIO, he didn't call the security service saying this guy's made a threat against me. He said, praise be to God that I've got people, that my people will not let me lead them astray, right? So it's not a fact that I'm a dictator. Islam and Islamic law actually promoted and instilled democracy, which had not seen before it. It was all emperors and rulers and kings. In Islam, an emperor, a ruler, or a king is forbidden. It has to be general consensus on who the leader is. Now, the way we have democracy now, for example, is you either have red or blue, Labor, Liberal, Democrat, Republican, and then you vote for that party, and then you're stuck with that party for 4 years. So, for example, if Julie Gillard now, so we're doing a carbon tax, you have to put up with it. That is it. That, to me, is not a democracy. When someone says we're going to go to war, bad luck. I've decided we are going to war. That's not a democracy. A democracy, to me, is the will of the people. Right.
I guess one point of difference might be that within that Islamic democracy you described, it's essentially still clerics who form the decision.
Not necessarily.
No, it's a shura. It's a council.
Like certain
religious leaders.
Well, the religious leaders that get together because they're the ones that, one, know the Constitution better than anybody, and they're the most God-fearing.
So there's a fusion of church and state.
Well, we don't believe in the separation.
Yeah, you don't believe in the
separation. No, because it's the most God-fearing. So who better to lead a people than someone who's more God-fearing, because he knows he can't outdo God. He knows he can't outsmart, and he knows that there will come a day where he has to meet his Lord, and he will be accounted for every single person that he was leading.
I might need, to move us on, because we've only got a few minutes left. I'd like to pick up, Mermet, you mentioned in your book on Sharia that, and I'll paraphrase you rather, you say that the objective of Sharia is that every person has the right to live in safety, that there should be no coercion, and that everyone should have the ability to think freely, and there is no compulsion in religion. That certainly doesn't seem to be the picture we see when we look to majority Muslim countries. It's widely reported, for instance, that someone of an Islamic faith is not allowed to convert to another religion. Would you like to comment on that?
Look, as I think we have established that the problems we're seeing today hinges on colonialism, its aftermath, the discontinuity of Islamic law, its lack of development. So we have problems, admittedly, in the Muslim world. But when you go to, that statement is based on the 5 essential rights that Sharia protects: property, life, family, religion, and mind, which is freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Quran says, chapter 2, verse 256, there's no compulsion in religion. There's nothing in the Quran that says you have to force people into belief. On the contrary, there's a lot of verses that says you can't.
So
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Is it all right for a Muslim person, according to the Quran, according to Sharia, to deny their faith and live peaceably with other Muslims?
If you're asking about apostasy, is that what you...
I guess I am, yes.
Yeah. There's an issue with apostasy in that it's been interpreted after Prophet Muhammad, some centuries after, that it relates to only leaving religion. But in the time of the Prophet and a century after that, it was linked with high treason. Because at the time, when you have two societies fighting each other, and one person gets out of the religion and goes to the other side and finds back, that's high treason, and that's punishable.
Sorry, for the sake of time, I might need just to bring us to the present. Just a very quick answer. Today, in Muslim-majority countries, is it all right to abandon your faith and even adopt a Christian faith?
Most Muslim countries, it's all right, but only in selected countries like Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, or countries like this who have serious issues in terms of proper governance and so on. But countries like Indonesia, Turkey, elsewhere, Malaysia, this doesn't happen. Some of these
Sam, would you like to make a
I'd
brief
say
comment on
that's
that?
clearly not the case in many of those countries.
Well, Turkey.
Well, in Malaysia...
Turkey doesn't even have capital punishment.
Yeah, but I'm saying Malaysia was mentioned. In Malaysia, when you are born, you are told what religion you are, and it is very difficult, if not impossible, for a Malay to change their religion. I just feel that there's a lot of denial that is happening in this discussion, in that there are things that are happening that we see happening that are reported happening, excuse me, but we're told, no, they're not, and that's not a reflection of Islam, when I think in many ways it is.
And how would this be a point of difference in your mind with Christianity? I mean, how does freedom work within Christianity in this regard?
Well, certainly as Christians, we don't have a law of apostasy. For us, the Bible often talks about people who come into the faith and then they may leave, but we don't have a law of apostasy, so it's not a matter for us like that. And because we're not seeking to have a legal system, there's no apostasy law either.
But how do you explain Inquisition? How do you explain 100-year sectarian wars in Europe, which is at the source of secularism and so on? How do we explain that? 500,000 Muslims and Jews were expelled from Spain. They were settled in Muslim Ottoman Empire. They took refuge. They were settled as refugees.
Okay, but even with that history, to understand the Inquisition, you need to understand the Islamic conquest of Spain and what was happening.
But it was a church thing. Yeah. It was a religious persecution.
The Inquisition came after the expulsion, absolutely, but it was seeking to reverse the Islamic occupation. I think this is one of the areas we've spoken about European colonisation, but we don't often talk about the Islamic empires and their colonisations and the effect that had on the indigenous populations. And I think that needs to be brought into it. We need to understand their role in the slave trade, for instance, something that most people have no concept about, yet it was the main slave trade of world history, yet it's almost basically not known about.
But Spain, for example, lived its golden era during Muslim rule. Jewish community says this.
Now,
if you ask Jews...
I just have to say, well, that is what's always put forward, that Spain is the golden one, but you mentioned Bernard Lewis before. He actually says that is a myth and that it actually doesn't exist. And if you read Maimonides, who fled Spain, he actually said that...
Where did he go? He went to Egypt, which is another Muslim country.
Yes, but he still had to flee from it.
Because at the time there were Almohads. Almohads were extremists. So we have extremism issue, but the problem is we're linking extremism to Islam itself. That is the thing that I'm against. Islam is not an extremist religion, but there are extremist Muslims who defame Islam itself, and then others just jump on it.
Okay, I might ask you just quickly to make 30-second final comments, because I'm mindful people do need, unfortunately, to get back to work. So I might start with you, Mermet, if you don't mind saying for 30 seconds your feeling for the future here, for the Muslim community and Sharia law in Australia.
Look, Muslims are here, I feel, because they love Australia, they feel they're Australian, and they want to adapt to this country, and part of that adaptation is asking themselves, how can we live our religion in Australia? And when we ask this question, sometimes there are tensions, but I feel that we can resolve these things discussing it properly, sitting down around the table with politicians or legal experts, whatever, and solving them. We can't put it under the carpet.
Yeah. Sam?
Sure. I guess in terms of the question today, I think that the great thing about Australia is that it already allows Muslims to practice most of Sharia. And so there's already a great freedom, and I don't believe we need to extend that any further. I think as we want to take this debate further, we need to not be in denial about what the Quran and the Hadith and the Sharia actually teach. We mustn't be in denial about that. And I think it would also be really helpful for us to listen to the people who aren't Muslims, who have been living under Sharia for many years.
Okay, Diaa.
Okay, well, you can't ask any Muslims to live under Sharia because we said that there is no real Sharia-run country. But in closing, I would urge, it's easy for me to stand here and tell you what Islam is, what Sharia is, who the Prophet Muhammad is, but I just have a request. If you go back and search what historians say, non-Muslim historians say about the Prophet Muhammad, say about Islam, just Google it and see what they say. El Martin, Napoleon, Gandhi, George Bernard Shaw, Michael H. Hart. See what they say about Islam, about the Prophet Muhammad, about Sharia law, and I promise you, you'll be shocked. You know, what some of us say here, what some people get on the media and say, what you might see in the news. Go read the ones who are the historians, your theologians, and see what they say. And you'll be I think you'll be shocked. I won't say pleasantly shocked, but you'll be shocked.
Okay, wonderful. That's a good challenge for us to take up. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking them.